Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Calls for peace from a communist country. Is the free world falling behind when it comes to putting an end to Russia's war in Ukraine? And what does the China-Russia no-limits friendship mean for America? We sat down with John Sitilides, geopolitical strategist and diplomacy consultant to the State Department, for insight. John Sitilides, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So it seems right now, with the one-year anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there is now talks by China that there's going to be, a potential peace deal. That's what China's trying to do in terms of Russia and Ukraine. What do you make of that, especially with China maybe taking the lead here?
It would not be surprised overall if China were to look to play some type of a leadership diplomatic role here. After all, it has very good ties with no conditions and no qualifications with Russia, as Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin announced on the eve of the invasion last February at the Beijing Olympics, but also because China has very important economic relations with the United States, with Europe, and it wants especially to continue to have those European relations flourishing, especially with Germany. And so I think it's very important as an opportunity for China to attempt to demonstrate that it can play some type of a honest broker role here. The problem is that China has been assisting Russia openly and covertly over the past 12 months in terms of providing sustenance for the Russian economy, purchasing Russian hydrocarbons and military hardware, and also making available to the Russian economy semiconductors, chips, and ammunition and weapons parts, so that they're not selling the kinds of equipment that would automatically bring about U.S. and Western sanctions on China, but just enough below the radar to provide as much support to Russia as possible without punishing the Chinese economy. So China is in a very precarious position over here, and I think especially with the inability of the world to hold China accountable for unleashing the COVID virus on the world in 2020, there's a sense that China is not a country to be trusted.
And John, on that note, it seems one of the questions coming up is why isn't the U.S. or even Europe taking the lead and trying to broker the peace talks? Why does it seem China's the one doing that?
It's a great question. And for the most part, in the United States and in many, although I won't say all European capitals, there's still a sense that Ukraine, given enough munitions, given enough military aid, given enough financial support for its devastated economy, can somehow not only continue this war with Russia indefinitely, to use the president's words from several days ago, whatever it takes, although we don't know what it means, that somehow Russia can actually brought to heal. And I'm concerned that we're entering a very dangerous period in the Russia-Ukraine war, because we don't know to what extent Vladimir Putin, who surprised most people in the West and maybe around the world with the initial invasion and the scale of the invasion in February of last year, might not surprise the world again by actually detonating a low-yield tactical nuclear weapon if he feels that the U.S. and Europe are providing the kinds of armaments to Ukraine that are crossing a red line and potentially can strike targets deep inside of Russia.
And John, earlier you mentioned China's support for Russia, either covertly or overtly. And it seems, right now there's an article out from Der Spiegel, German newspaper, saying that China could be sending combat drones to Russia maybe as soon as April. And recently the U.S. is warning China that if they do send lethal aid to Russia, there will be consequences. What would those consequences look like?
That's going to be an enormous challenge for the White House. First of all, if the reports are true, and I have no way of knowing at this early stage whether or not the Der Spiegel report is accurate, but it's not necessarily surprising. And I think if you see and hear the statements emanating from Beijing, including in recent days, but even going as recently as the October 22 Party Congress, where Xi Jinping spoke about the importance of Chinese foreign policy as part of the larger rejuvenation strategy. I think what you're seeing here in China is, first of all, very strong concern that the U.S. and the West are, quote unquote, telling China or instructing China, which sees itself as a world-class power, to not meddle in the Ukrainian war and to remain neutral if they won't actually support Ukraine, at least don't support Russia. But I think also China is looking to see what is happening in Ukraine in the context of what may be happening in Taiwan. But I think the Chinese position is pretty straightforward. It's the U.S. and NATO that are sending weapons into Ukraine, that are sustaining and escalating the war. Why doesn't China have the right to do so if it decides it's in its national interest to do so? But on the other hand, the Chinese economy is somewhat wobbly still with the sudden end to the COVID lockdown policy, the zero COVID policy. And I think that Chinese Communist Party leaders, however malign their overall intentions may be, are smart enough to understand that they don't want the Chinese economy to suffer under the kind of sanctions regime that the U.S. and Europe have imposed on Russia and on Russian entities and Russian business executives and the like. Then we have leverage by Beijing on the United States, because if there are counter sanctions on the U.S. economy, which is still extraordinarily dependent on the Chinese economy, not only for regular consumer goods, but also for pharmaceuticals, for critical minerals, for a whole host of issues that would be extraordinarily deleterious to the American economy if the Chinese were to cut those off. You see where there's a very interesting game of cat and mouse being played at a strategic level. And I think the best way forward is for every leader to understand how to pursue their best national interests without escalating an already dangerous situation to the point where people are talking seriously about the possibility of a world war in a way that we simply haven't heard anyone talking, at least not at this pace and at this level, since the 1980s.
And on that note, John, what would the U.S. policy, or what should the U.S. policy look like going forward?
We have a tremendous deficit in strategic thinking in the United States that dates back several decades now, especially during the Cold War. Let me emphasize that American strategy vis-a-vis what was then the Soviet Union was first and foremost to not escalate any potential proxy war into a nuclear exchange, right? To prevent a nuclear war from taking place. At the same time, let me also emphasize that American strategy was always to make sure that China and the Soviet Union, and today that would translate into China and Russia, are not closer to each other than the U.S. is with either one. Now, that's going to be a problem that is really more of Beijing's making as it pertains to China. There's really no visible, understandable way to see how the U.S. and China become closer partners now that this great power rivalry has been unleashed with the rise of Xi Jinping over the last 10 years in China. But the U.S. should be thinking about long-term ways to ensure that Russia is not closer to China than it is to the United States and to the West, but somehow to figure out a way to peel Russia back from what's becoming its increasing dependence on China, as you note, as China's junior partner, in a way that's only going to be harmful to Russian national interests down the road. Now, a lot of this may sound like wishful thinking, because right now we're still dealing with a murderous Vladimir Putin and a horrific invasion of Ukraine and a war of attrition that is killing hundreds of thousands of innocent Ukrainian citizens, and for that matter, Russian and Ukrainian soldiers on both sides of the trenches. But we have to think strategically, even as we're dealing with this war today, tomorrow, and next month. And the long-term consequences of errors today could set back American global leadership for the remainder of the century. So we need to be able to not just walk and chew gum at the same time, but to carve out a grand strategy for the future of this century, even as we look to see how we uphold sovereignty and territorial integrity in countries such as Ukraine and potentially in Taiwan in the next several years.
Well, John Sitilides, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for letting me share my insights with you.